welcome during the course of this programme. And in which decade were you there? When were you little? When were you getting your knees scabbed? When was your nose bleeding? When was your mum yelling at you to come in for your tea? I tell you, we're going to talk about the 60s now. Parson Cross in the 60s. That's because Steve Bush, who was one of 8 on the Parson Cross estate, has written a book called Geeor Ruwerin. I think I can say that. Has it, Steve? Was that close enough?
Yeah, that was spot on, that, Dean.
Was it? Yeah, I mean, for somebody who was actually born in London, half the family's from Sheffield, because my dad grew up in Sheffield, my granddad is. It's a strange situation to be halfway down the M1 when it comes to how you actually speak. But over the years, I've acquired the words and phrases, and I understand that the word roaring, which means to cry, was something that actually started on the Parson Cross estate. Is that right?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the origins of it come from the Parson Cross. Basically, it's roaring like a lion would roar, and it's just putting that into a Parson Cross vernacular. And as well as stop crying, it can also mean stop whinging, stop moaning.
Stop snivelling.
Yeah, you'd say it to anybody who's been a bit wimpy.
Now, when did you first start to pull together a few ideas about writing about childhood?
Well, it kind of happened probably 8 or 9 years ago. I was contributing to one of the social networking sites, principally the Sheffield Forum, and whenever people asked questions like, do you remember going on day trips to Cleethorpes with the working men's clubs, or do you remember going country dancing with the school, things like that, rather than just say yes, I'd compose a little story about it, and it's all basically true, you know, maybe a little mild exaggeration for comic effect. But I started telling the story from the point of view as how I remembered it. And I'd been doing this for a couple of years, and I started to get 1 or 2 emails, some from people I knew, but equally some from people I didn't know. And they said, this is actually quite interesting. You ought to think about doing something a bit more substantive with it. And about 5 or 6 months ago, my daughter was in the Star Shop talking to Debbie. And she mentioned it to Debbie that I'd got this collection of stories. So Debbie said, well, send them in and we'll see if we can do anything. And then 5 months later, I was walking down York Street and there was my book in the window. One of the proudest moments in my life.
I can imagine. That's fantastic. Did you ever read Graham Shepherd's Get the Neck Weshed?
I did.
That's about the 50s, I think, wasn't it?
That's based partly on the Parson Cross, partly on Shirecliffe, and it's around the 50s. And his book came out a couple of weeks after I'd sent mine off to the publishers, and I thought at first they might clash, but having read Graham's lovely book, it's a decade earlier, and I would say, if anything, the two really complement each other.
What was on Parson Cross estate before the estate? Was there anything there at all?
No, I've done a little bit of research into it, and between, say, Wasley Bridge and Hillsborough, and then Ecclesfield and Grenoside at the other end, it seems there was absolutely nothing, just lots and lots of farmland. And it was about the 1930s where the social housing shortage was really starting to bite, and all the steel workers were living in houses that were covered in grime and things like that. And Sheffield had to expand. Geographically it had to expand, and what's now Parson Cross was an obvious area to do it. And just before and just after the war, and even sometimes during the war, they built about 10,000 council houses, and it's quite appropriate with the council housing talks that are going on in the TV show tonight.
It is, yeah. It looks as if it's going to be a good programme, BBC 4.
Yeah, I mean, for me, social housing, certainly at that point, was an absolute necessity.
It was crucial, wasn't it, when you think of the sheer scale of the building? Where were those people going to go if those buildings hadn't come along?
And previous to that, they were all living in places like Healy and Attercliffe, and not that there's anything wrong with those, but they were very much in the shadow of all the factories. And moving out to places like Parson Cross allowed them fields, gardens front and back, indoor toilets, and it opened up a whole new world for them.
Did it come before or after Shirecliffe, or about the same time? Because there's similar designs to the property.
Yeah, I suspect it came about the same time. They're often kind of looked at as being twin estates, Parson Cross and Shirecliffe, so I suspect that their development runs pretty much parallel.
Were you born in a property on the Parson Cross estate, or was that your first home? Or
I was actually born in the front bedroom at 387 Wordsworth Avenue, and my mum to this day, in fact I've mentioned it a little bit in the book, of the 8 children that she had, I was by far the most difficult birth. I came out bum first, and it's no exaggeration to say that my mum nearly died having me, but so all my very, very early memories are around Parson Cross.
With 8 of you, you've got a great mine of information there, haven't you?
Yeah, a lot of the photos in the book came from my eldest brother Tony, who now works in London. During the 60s, he was one of the few people really who had a camera, and cameras were expensive in those days, and getting photos developed was expensive, and for him it was his main hobby, photography. So we've got quite a few lovely pictures because my brother had the wherewithal to take up photography as a hobby.
That's brilliant. Now the thing is that whenever you look back, whenever you try and think what happened and what was going on in your young life, you remember some things, but maybe some of the others see things a bit differently, and sometimes you remember things that other people don't, and vice versa. Have you found that in trying to pull the book together and the stories together?
Well, a few of the people I've spoken to, some of whom are in the book, and others that I grew up with around the time, they actually seem to think that their memories are pretty much the same as mine.
That's good.
The main feedback I've had is that I've got the memories pretty spot on. A couple of my elder brothers have both said to me, that's as I remember it, and my sister, she too, she was talking about the time when I was only 3 or 4 years old, and I tell a story about working with the builders on the building site at the age of 4, and my sister says that's exactly what happened, that's how it was.
Do you still believe, I mean, you did say at one stage that growing up in the 60s there couldn't have been a better decade to grow up in. You stick with that, do you?
I do. I mean, if you think about it, one of the ways I always used to measure the 60s is, if you think in 1960 the most popular pop group in Britain was probably the Shadows, and if you make a mental picture of the Shadows, and then fast forward to 1970, most popular pop group Led Zeppelin, and make a mental picture of Led Zeppelin, they're a million miles apart. They're more than a decade apart, and that's how much the 60s changed. And I know I'm not the first to say this, but life in the 1960s went from black and white to colour.
It did, didn't it?
It
a
did.
lot of that. You look at all the photographs of people gathered together on special occasions in 1960, 61, or in the evenings, looking smart to go out to a special function, and then, as you say, go forward 10 years.
Yeah.
You'd think you were in a different country on a different planet.
It's a whole world away, isn't it?
It's a fantastic book.
And it was a great experience to live through that. I was 5 in 1960 and 15 in 1970, the most influential years of my life, and I just had a whale of a time. I had a glorious childhood, Dean.
You don't have to grow up on Parson Cross to enjoy this book by the sound of things. There'll be so many echoes from around South Yorkshire that people will recognise instantaneously. The title not being the least, Geeor Ruwerin is what it's called. It's been great to talk to you, Steve, and good luck with it.
Dean, thank you very much.
Steve Bush is the name. Geeor Ruwerin. You can get it at Waterstones, you can get it at Smith's, or you can get it at the Star Shop. How much is it?
$7.95.
Yeah, it's $7.95, and it's well worth it. There's lots of happy memories there for people, and I think it'll be the starting point for lots of conversations. BBC Radio Sheffield coming up next.